all have secrets that we keep hidden deep within ourselves. But what happens when those secrets are so dark, so twisted, that they can only lead to one thing, a path of destruction? Such was the case with Chris Watts, who seemed like an ordinary man, living an ordinary life. He had a good job, a beautiful wife, and 2 young daughters. But beneath the surface, Chris was struggling with resentment towards his family, his financial struggles, and the pressure of juggling 2 relationships. His resentment grew, like a cancer, until it consumed him entirely, leading to an unthinkable act of violence that shook the community to its core. This is the story of hidden resentment. A story of a man who couldn't keep his dark secrets hidden any longer, and the devastating consequences that followed. Chris Watts lived in a comfortable suburban home in Colorado with his pregnant wife Shanann, and their 2 daughters, Bella and Celeste. From the outside, they seemed like a happy family. Chris had a well-paying job, but his family's financial situation was precarious. They had struggled with debt for years, and the pressure to provide for his growing family was weighing heavily on him. The added stress of his affair with a coworker only exacerbated their situation. Meanwhile, Shanann was building a successful business in the direct sales industry, which added its own pressures as she worked long hours to support their family. Despite their success, the financial burden was a constant source of tension in their relationship. The pressure only grew as Shanann's pregnancy progressed, and she became increasingly aware of the growing distance between them. On August 13, 2018, Shanann returned home from a business trip to Arizona, excited to be reunited with her family. She was dropped off by her best friend Nicole Atkinson at her home early in the morning. She was unaware of the tension between her and Chris, and his growing resentment towards their relationship. That night, after an argument about their marriage, Chris strangled Shanann to death in their bed. He then went to his daughters' rooms, where he smothered them in their sleep. He then loaded their bodies into his truck and drove to an oil site where he worked. There, he dropped Bella and Celeste in separate oil tanks, one after the other. Chris then buried Shanann's body in a shallow grave nearby. For several days, Chris pretended that his family was missing, making public appeals for their return, while the police and the community frantically searched for any sign of their whereabouts. As the search for Shanann, Bella, and Celeste continued, Chris's story began to unravel. Nicole Atkinson had become increasingly worried when she couldn't reach Shanann after her flight landed on August 13. She and her son went to the Watts home and called the police for a wellness check. The police arrived at the house, and Chris arrived from work and opened the door. He appeared calm and collected and not worried about his family at all. They searched the house but found nothing. Meanwhile, Nicole's son found Shanann's phone in the sofa cushions, which raised even more suspicion. The police also went to the neighbor. Nate Trinastick, who lived next to Chris Watts' home, has a surveillance footage that captured Watts loading his truck just after 5 a.m. that morning. Chris nervously explains his behavior away that morning, telling the officer that he had moved the truck from its usual spot because it had been easier to lug everything with all the tools he had to bring in. He also said had been loading the truck early that morning to prepare for a busy workday. However, Trinastick is already starting to question his neighbor's unusual behavior. He can be heard telling the officer that Watts seemed to be fidgety and rocking back and forth. He even shows the officer the surveillance footage again. Trinastick mentioned to the officer how he found Chris' behavior as unusual for multiple reasons. He thought it was odd that Watts was talking a lot when he usually never talks, and it was also strange for him to see Chris loading things into the cab of the truck rather than the back of the vehicle. The police continued their investigation, and after finding the missing sheet and a GPS tracker that belonged to Shanann, they began to suspect foul play. It wasn't long before Chris's facade crumbled, and he confessed to the murders. He led the police to the site where he had buried his family, and the full horror of what had taken place began to come to light. The trial began, with the community grappling with the horror of what had happened. The defense team argued that Chris had been suffering from a mental illness that drove him to commit the murders. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence against Chris, including his affair and hidden resentment towards his family. The jury found him guilty on all counts, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The community was left to pick up the pieces and try to make sense of the senseless horror that had taken place. The shock of the murders left many wondering how someone they knew could be capable of such heinous acts. The chilling realization that even those closest to us could be capable of unspeakable acts lingered,